Welcome to the Afghanistan Project Podcast. I'm Beth Bailey here with my co-host Michael Cook. Today we're excited to kick off a sub-series within the podcast that will unravel the events leading up to the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan 2 years after the events began to occur. We're thrilled to invite back Bill Roggio, an expert whose understanding of the Taliban allowed him to track their inevitable ascent to power far more accurately than government analysts who predicted the Taliban would not topple the Afghan government until months or even years after our withdrawal. Bill Roggio is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and edits the Foundation's Long War Journal, which has done some of the most thorough open source reporting on the global war on terror's various fields of conflict throughout Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. Bill is also a veteran of the U.S. Army and New Jersey National Guard, and he spent time embedded with the Canadian Army in Afghanistan in 2006. Bill, it's so glad to have you back with us today.
Beth, Michael, thanks for having me back on, and thank you for that kind introduction.
It is our pleasure. I want to start by just bringing up, this is the reason we're here today. This is the map. It's not a very good rendition of it, but this is the map that a lot of people probably saw in the days leading up to the Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan, but it only represents really a small portion of the map that you had been doing for years for FDD, kind of tracking the Taliban's control of territory. So can you bring us back to when you started this map and what led you to creating it and how you populated it?
Yeah, it's really an interesting story. It's strange. I mean, I started almost a decade ago. I want to say the origins of this were about 2013, 14, right when the U.S. was transferring, quote unquote, transferring control to the Afghan security forces. I remember reading a report in an Afghan newspaper news source about 8 districts being under Taliban control. One of them was Bagram in Helmand province, which I had discovered at that time was always under Taliban, was never liberated from the Taliban, even after the U.S. invasion in 2001 and the fall of the Taliban in 2002. So, and at the same time, the U.S. and Afghan counterinsurgency strategy was announced that they would secure the urban areas or the important districts in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, think of districts as counties here in the United States, and provinces are equivalent to states. There's 407 districts in Afghanistan. So I decided. Back to the U.S. said the counterinsurgency strategy was, secure the urban areas or what they called strategic districts, and they would, let the rural districts go. They'd leave them to the Taliban. Basically, they didn't say that, but that was the implication. And the Taliban's response was, "Well, that's great. We'll organize in the rural areas," and this is what they were doing anyway. "And we'll meet you in the urban areas." And so, seeing the information on the districts under Taliban control, seeing what the Taliban said about their strategy, what the U.S. and Afghan government said about their strategy, I decided, well, this is something I could take a stab at tracking. So I put together a little database, started it on a Google map, was able to get an overlay of the 407 districts, and very difficult going in the beginning. Getting news from all these districts in Afghanistan, extremely difficult. So it was like, the beginning of putting together a puzzle, right? You get the edges, and then you get a little piece here, and it starts to come together. And this really, I didn't feel I had a real solid look at what was happening until sometime around mid to late 2016. At this point in time, so I'm publishing this map online, and at some point, the SIGAR, the Special Investigator General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, apparently they were interested, and they asked the Department of Defense to put together a district, assessment. Now, my assessment was done. Sorry if this is a long story, but my assessment was done. I did it through 3 different classifications: either Taliban controlled, government controlled, or contested. My theory there is you're not half pregnant. Either the district's contested or it's controlled by the Taliban or controlled by the government. When SIGAR did its map, they had 5. This was given to it by the U.S. military. 5 levels. So they, government or Taliban controlled, government or Taliban influenced, or contested. And by the way, I figured out right away that they would use those influence designations to downplay Taliban control or to downplay contested, and I was easily able to test that theory. So again, I'm starting this map. I'm putting it together. I'm actually contacted. I can't remember what year. Probably somewhere in 2015 when SIGAR was interested. A colonel in Kabul called me and was like, "Bill, how are you putting this together?" And my response was, "Wait a second. You guys aren't doing this. You guys aren't trying to track the security in districts where you're sending U.S. troops, where you're sending State Department and U.S. aid officials, where your Afghan allies are operating. You don't want to understand, So his answer, without saying it, was, "No, we're not, but we're going to do it." And then this is how the information went to SIGAR. So my information was open source, government reports, news reports, and statements by the Taliban. And I was widely criticized for using Taliban statements, but the Taliban statements were accurate. They were easily tracked in the press over time. Now they would tell you when they took one, but they usually wouldn't tell you when they lost control of a district. So that was recognizable. But the Taliban, look, they lied about a lot of things, but they typically didn't lie about their military operations. They might inflate casualties of an operation, say more Americans were killed or wounded, but that operation took place, and it was the same type of I'll call it reporting by them when it came to district control. And so, again, by around 2000, the map that you held up, I believe that goes back to about around 2016, 2017. That was when I felt I had a real good handle, or I had enough data that the puzzle was, let's call it 80 to 90% complete. SIGAR is publishing these reports. I reach out to them and say, "Hey, would you share the underlying data here?" And they did. They shared it with me, and I was able to fill in some holes, and even found some Taliban controlled and influence and contested districts. Now, if a district was listed as influenced by SIGAR, I would typically call that contested. That was, but in some cases, again, I'll get back to where where they were fudging the data, where I could see it. For instance, I'll use Helmand province or Kunduz province. Helmand, there's anywhere 13 or 14 districts there. At any point in time by 2016-17, the Taliban controlled 7 to 8 districts and contested 5 to 6 districts, so depending. And SIGAR, again, it was their data they were given by the DoD. We would say, well, the Taliban control 3 districts. 5 districts are contested, and and then a couple others in those other ranges, right? And that was really, and even people in the press, anyone who was following Afghanistan, could look at either Kunduz or could look at Helmand province, and understand that you were getting the rosy assessment from the U.S. military. So that's the origin of that. By 2017, and I want to be clear about this with the map. I never felt that it was an assessment. I always said you could take 20 districts and make them controlled one way, either Taliban or government controlled, and make them contested. Take some of these contested districts, make it controlled. I viewed it like, not that I'm an artist, but like a Monet painting or something like that, right? Where the dots are there and you look real close and you're like, what am I looking at? But when you back out, you see it, right? And that's kind of how I viewed that map. It was giving you the trends. One of the things I had predicted was that the Taliban was using these rural areas again, it was Taliban strategy. I read it in English on the Taliban's website on Voice of Jihad. They published in 5 different languages. All you needed to do was read English. Every once in a while, I would double check to make sure they were saying the same thing in all the languages. They were. And so I watched this belt form around all the way from Nimruz and Farah province in the west, across Helmand and Kandahar, northern Helmand and Kandahar, through Ghazni. And you could see that they were using this belt to spread their influence in the south. You could see similar pattern in the north, which was very surprising. How the Taliban gained strength. So that's in the not the short version, but that's the origin of the map. It was something I never expected. At the end, by the end, that map was everywhere. It was on CNN. It was on PBS, on ABC, NBC, CBS News, on every network being showed anytime an Afghan President Trump pointed to the map and said, "Look at it, turn red, turn black." And when Biden was speaking, the map would be up on. When I started this, it was really for myself to test the theory, right? And then I was like, "Whoa, I could share it." And then I've also viewed it as like, "Hey, maybe interested parties, because people that read the Long War Journal, they're in State Department and DOD and intelligence. Maybe this would wake them up. Like maybe, at some point I realized that that was a reason for publishing, for sharing the information. Like it was a warning. And I was able to, when President Biden announced the withdrawal in April 15th, I was on TV or radio or both. And I said, look, if the government, based on what I've tracked and what I'm seeing, and without the U.S. support, if the Afghan government makes it out by the end of the summer, they'll be lucky. And they collapsed on August 15th, so 5 weeks before the end of the summer. And I was able to do that because I understood their strategy. I understood the key districts they were taking, how they were using them for training camps, to raise taxes, to recruit, to indoctrinate, to host foreign terror groups, which were fighting in their ranks. And that's the map in a nutshell. So, yeah.
Why do you think the intelligence community wasn't able to make that same assessment?
I know there were individuals within the military and the intelligence community that understood this. Guys who had their nose to the grindstone. They saw this and they understood it. I don't know if you recall the CENTCOM brouhaha over the intelligence being mutated in Iraq that came up, but it was the same type of thing. So basically in Iraq, they were warning that the situation at the low levels, the analysts were saying, look, things are getting worse. Things are getting worse. And as those assessments made it up the chain of command, they were mutated. They were adjusted to please political masters, because once the government wants to leave, once President Obama says he wants out of Afghanistan, once President Trump says he wants out of Afghanistan, and once President Biden says he wants out of Afghanistan, the higher ups, they're just looking to fulfill the wishes of their political masters. And how can you leave Afghanistan? You can't leave Afghanistan if Al Qaeda's allied with the Taliban, if Al Qaeda has a strong presence, if the Taliban isn't willing to negotiate with the Afghan government and share power, so all of those things. So, those were the lies that U.S. officials told themselves. Either they knew the truth and they were lying, or they didn't know. And I don't know what's worse, to be honest with you. I think I can understand lying, but the ignorance is, if that's the case, I think sometimes it was a mix of both. It depended on the official. I can't tell you who was who, but this is what was happening. And so the intelligence was massaged and softened as it went up each level of the chain of command, to the point where it just became, things aren't as bad as they seem. The funny thing is my data, the data on the map never matched SIGAR's. SIGAR's data was 90 days old when it was released. My map data was always in real time. But even then, I was only like, if you adjusted the estimates again with their influence versus my assessment of contested and all of that, it's still like, so they were always 5 to 15% softer or more rosy than my assessment. It was still bad. So it was there for them to see, but they were interpreting, even if they took like the best case estimate that they could have taken, still showed that they were losing 1 to 3% of the districts per quarter. And remember that most people don't remember this, but I do, because I'm kind of a geek and this is what I do. But the General Miller, in I believe it was late 2017, early 2018, he stopped the publishing of that data because it didn't show what the U.S. military wanted you to see. When they created this map, what their goal was, this will show the Afghan military is taking charge, that they're regaining territory, that they could take the fight to the Taliban. But what the data showed is the opposite happening. And so General Miller's response to that was, well, security in the districts or fighting the Taliban, that isn't the measure of success in Afghanistan. The real measure of success was negotiating with the Taliban. And when I see a general who's in charge of military affairs in a country completely dismiss the security situation, and look, we have a State Department. Let the State Department negotiate. And General Miller, you do your job of being honest, but again, either General Miller didn't know what he was saying or he was lying to us. Neither are good, and I can't forgive him for him and other military leaders for taking us down that path. They told us everything was fine when it wasn't, or it will be fine, that negotiations would work. And, so really, that's a long way of getting around to answer your question, Michael, but it was the politics of this. The politics caused the intelligence to be softened as it worked up the chain of the command, and it was softened to the point where their political masters got what they wanted, got what they needed in order to execute a withdrawal that was an absolute disaster, which anyone with a brain who watched television from the spring of 2021 to the collapse of and ultimate withdrawal, final withdrawal of U.S. troops, it was a disaster.
Yeah, and it's kind of back to that compounding issue that every troop that's ever deployed there has experienced of you being told that you moved the needle on your deployment, right? And saying that you accomplished your mission whether you did or not. You get 20 years of that compounding. That'll lead to a pretty rosy assessment, I feel.
Yeah, and I always go back to I believe it was Senator Elizabeth Warren in a hearing where I don't remember who she was speaking with, but she said, we've turned the corner so many times that we've been around the block, 8 times or something, something like that. Yeah, at some point, you could tell us everything's great, but anyone who's been there and anyone who followed this closely knew things weren't great. Anyone who was willing to admit, I often get called. I was harassed by people in the military, didn't like what I was doing. Afghans didn't like what I was doing. I was called pro-Taliban. I was said I was on the ISI, or Pakistan's Inter-Service Intelligence Agency. I was accused of being on their payroll, on the Taliban's payroll. Absolutely insanity. By the way, I've been accused of being Mossad, CIA, and also Research and Analysis Wing, which is Indian intelligence. If y'all are listening, I'm waiting for my first paycheck. It's been since 2005, since 2006 that I'm doing this professionally. If you need my address, reach me. I'll get that to you. But, it's just that absolute insanity. People, again, I always go back, this was an intelligence failure, but not within the rank and file of the intelligence community. It was intelligence failure within the leadership, because somebody in the military, someone in at the higher levels in the CIA and the DIA, needed to stand up and say, the emperor has no clothes, and they all refused to do it. So it wasn't, all the information was there. It was all there if you wanted to take an objective view of what was happening. No one wishes they were wrong more than me. Look, I'll share this as well. This is just how crazy it was. A friend of mine, it was Ambassador Hussein Haqqani, right? He reached out to me. I want to say it was in April or May of 2021. I never said who actually gave this information to me, but it doesn't matter now. And he sends me this map, and it's created by, I believe it was Afghanistan's Interior Ministry. And he's like, Bill, they want to release this to rebut your information. And I looked at it, and it actually looked better than it looked in like 2016. And I remember saying to him, I said, Ambassador Haqqani, please tell them not to do this. They got enough problems. I don't want to rebut this, and they don't need me to rebut. And they never did really. I still have a copy of that, by the way. I mean, I wish I could hold it up for you and show it, but I wish I was prepared. But that was the insanity that was dealing. The Interior Ministry was more concerned with some guy at some think tank that most people dismiss as a crank, concerned with me, than the actual security situation and is properly assessing the security situation. And that's how you lose wars.
I can say, as somebody who was in the military intelligence structure, that it absolutely it catered to the beliefs of the leadership of the current, whoever was currently overseas, and not to the actual reality on the ground, or to the Pentagon leaders who we would have to go brief, who would ask us, how could we possibly say these things? And we would say the intelligence, and they would just their minds would be blown. And as to, I keep something on my board behind me. You guys can't see it from here, but it also alleges that the people I worked with were Taliban senior leaders running the Asymmetric Warfare Analysis Center where I worked, because that's the only way that we could possibly think what we thought. But anyway, that's
If I may, on that point really quick, one of the things that me and my colleague Tom Jocelyn and some other people I know, whose names I can't mention, we red teamed the Taliban. We tried to think like the Taliban. We read their information. It doesn't make me Taliban. It didn't make me sympathetic to them. I tried to. How do you defeat your enemy if you don't try to understand them? If you don't read what they're writing? And it wasn't just reading their strategy and reading their propaganda. It was matching that to reality on the ground. And when you put those two together, when what they say matches what they do, and, for instance, the Taliban would tell you, I'll never, we didn't fight. They said this in I'm going to say it was 2016. We didn't fight for decades and shed blood in order to share power with a puppet, craven puppet government. If you watch how they sidelined, even at that point in 2016, you knew that they would never negotiate with the Afghan government. What they said at that point in time matched with what they were doing. People said there was no military solution to Afghanistan. Sure there was. The Taliban had one. We all witnessed it, right? I knew this because I think I could think like them. It doesn't make me it made me hate them more. It made me want to beat them more. And it was frustrating that, that someone like you and Michael, I'm sure you've run into the same type of situation where trying to talk, shed some light on a difficult problem will often make you a pariah and then make people accuse you of being something that you're the opposite of. It was all very unseemly. I couldn't take enough showers to wash the stink off, to be honest.
Yeah. Well, and now what do we see is the same people who were saying, oh, well, we just need to negotiate with these people. They're very logical and they will react to diplomacy well. They said that back then. They're saying it again now. So it's just nothing has changed. It's which is why we're here today, because it's ongoing, our misunderstanding. And that is, like you say, it's the whole point. You have to know your enemy. That was what I was told to do before I entered my job. Read up on the Taliban, understand the way that they operate, the way that they change. And that's a very easy thing to do if you can. You have to do it. You have to actually put in the time, and you put in that time, especially as you're understanding, the amount of time that went into creating this map. I think we've talked about this before. It was like every month you had to devote hours to updating.
Yeah, if I could just a real quick on that. So it's, at some points, I was waiting for information, come in. Yeah, I had to go in every month. And by the way, by the end, when it was really mattered, I wanted that to be as accurate as it could be, given the constraints. I did it all by myself, by the way, with the help of a few good people. And I was able, FDD got me an assistant for the last couple of months, and we just worked feverishly to keep that up. And it wasn't just the map, by the way, that working on that. I tracked Taliban training camps, right? Training camp videos. I thought this was really important. I would post them and give a quick analysis of them. I've served in the military, served as an infantryman, so I understand a little bit about what I'm looking at. And I was mocked for this by people in the military. Oh, that's Mickey Mouse. That's and my response to that was, I don't think you guys understand. The Taliban wasn't fighting fighting us all of these years to beat us. They were fighting us, the varsity, so they could beat the freshman team, the Afghan military. And what you're seeing at these camps, sure, it isn't up to our standards, but what I saw was sure as hell good enough to beat the Afghans. And how do you think they beat the Afghan commandos on the field of battle, overran districts being held by Afghan commandos who were trained by us, who were given Western weaponry and helicopters and all of the support they needed? So, it was reading, understanding the Taliban's political mentality, tracking their operations, tracking their suicide operations, watching what they were doing in Pakistan. It was putting all of that together. It was an enormous task, and it was a bizarre labor of love. And again, I wish I was so wrong about this, because we'd be having a very different conversation today.
Do you think? Nice. Do you think that the Taliban trained their troops better than we trained the ANA?
Yes, I do. One of my biggest criticisms of the ANA was how we organized them. We organized them as a Western army. Afghanistan needed an army to fight an Afghan war and not a Western war. And we organized them. Made them dependent on air support, on ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, on Western logistics, on batteries for their sites that they wouldn't be able to get, and they needed light infantry because that's what they were up against. The Taliban. They needed a good morale. The Taliban had, for all their faults and flaws, they were ideologically driven, and they were well trained in guerrilla operations. The Afghan military didn't need artillery pieces and tanks and armored vehicles. They needed guys who could put boots on the ground and fight. And they needed to be organized in a way that, again, we created this federal army, so to speak, of Afghanistan. They needed a local National Guard that would have units deployed at the district level, recruited from people within those districts who had a stake in defending those areas, and then maybe provincial or regional level that then have more organized, units, brigades or divisions that can be deployed to deal with hotspots.
Mm-hmm.
But they weren't. We organized. We created local militias, which were very unreliable. And so this problem really, the same problems with the Afghan government, by the way, created a federal centralized government where the president was appointing the head of districts. That would be like the president of the United States appointing county leaders. Yeah, I can't see any problem with potential corruption there.
Yeah.
When you're appointing, it was this very similar problem. We tried to create Afghanistan in our image. And I do think the Taliban, watching their training, I mean, were they technically trained better? Maybe, maybe not. The units, I mean, look, they were able to overrun sophisticated Western trained Afghan units multiple times. They took control of cities 4 times between 2015 and 2017, made provincial capitals they overran.
Mm-hmm.
And held them for, in one case, 2 weeks for Kunduz, and then a week for Ghazni City, about a week for Farah City one time. I saw it was Afghan good enough, and that's what the Afghans needed. We created a Western military with all of this fancy equipment and Western ways of war that was not Afghan good enough. And so, yeah, I think the Taliban was better trained than
yeah. So we gave them a Western military when they needed a Northern alliance, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah, they needed a mix, right? Like they didn't be able to have a quick reaction force. That's really what they needed to put down hotspots. But they needed they needed local fighters. They needed actually I agree with you. That's a very good analogy, Michael. The Northern Alliance was able to hold out against the Taliban in several provinces against all odds because they had skin in the game, because it was their home, because they understood the terrain. And that's what Afghanistan needed, and we gave them something they didn't need because we thought we defeated the Taliban, right? Here's another thing I've put together, and hopefully one day I could release this. The Taliban's leadership today, right? Everyone said, oh, it's an interim government. It's the same interim government 2 years later. They've only replaced 2 ministers in 2 years. Somewhere around 50 to 60% of those leaders were leaders of the Taliban's first Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan on September 10th, 2011. A couple of them are the sons of those leaders who died. Sirajuddin Haqqani, his father Jalaluddin Haqqani, passed away several years ago. Mullah Omar's son, by the way, they're 2 of the most influential Taliban leaders. Their Minister of Defense and their Minister of the Interior. Oh, they're also both deputy emirs. Did we defeat the Taliban? We thought we did. People said it. But they fled to Pakistan and to a lesser extent Iran. They organized themselves. And here these old Taliban heads are, I always say, meet the new Taliban, same as the old Taliban. The only reason some of these guys, it's not 100%, is because some of these guys died, or some of these, probably most of them died is more like it. But when you didn't kill 50 to 60% of the original leadership, when they're able to just walk back into power, you didn't defeat that group. And that's an intelligence failure.
Well, and I wonder too, how many of those were kept from being killed on the battlefield because we had them in Gitmo
Yeah.
or at BAF
Many of
or
these,
somewhere.
several of them
Bagram,
were
sorry,
in
not
Gitmo.
BAF. Or, you know what I mean, the jail.
Yeah,
Same
Bagram.
thing.
Yeah,
Referring to,
Bagram.
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Several were in Bagram and several were in Gitmo. The Taliban 5, right, who were released for Bo Bergdahl. I believe all 5 are part of the government. I'd have to go back and check that. There's at least 4 of them. One was a provincial governor. Now he's a senior minister, and I think in intelligence or defense. A couple are ministers. They were at the negotiating table in Doha. We released them and let the Taliban send them to Doha so we can negotiate with them.
I can feel the fire rising inside of me as we talk about this. Literally, it's just so galling that these people that we thought were so, it's just, luckily I wear a lot of makeup, so you can't see that my cheeks are probably purple right now with anger. But yeah, it's unbelievable. And I want to go back to when things took a turn, because, you know, in April, we were talking about the map and how you definitely can see the rings of where the Taliban were in April, where they had kind of their outline of what would happen. And it kind of looked like maybe things could stay the same, but obviously that's what we're talking about there. You know, the government still had their control in the center. Did you think at that time, I think you said that was when you thought end of summer was probably going to be about the time, but I want to quote from, there's a CNBC article where you talk about the failure of military intelligence, but you also say that early May was when they started pre-positioning equipment and materials and organizing, planning, and executing a massive offensive. So is that when things really started to change from kind of just this ring of orange and then contested areas to what we saw more in, I mean, we go here.
So I'm going to go back to 2017, 18. The Trump administration took the fight to the Taliban briefly for about 9 months. It was a H.R. McMaster was national security advisor and convinced President Trump that, look, you know, we need to beat this back. And things actually stabilized for a short period of time. And then negotiations opened, and then he cut the deal with the Taliban in February 2020. And this is really when things began to turn, but it was a soft turn. What it was they started doing this soft campaign. They were taking control or contesting some districts, again at that slow pace, but it was that inexorable pace, right? It was that 3% pace was back on. But they were on a campaign to talk to district leaders, military commanders in the remote areas, and they were telling them, the Americans signed a deal. They're leaving. And, you know, you can fight us to the end, you can walk away, or you could surrender. And this got into the heads of a lot of Afghan officials and lower level Afghan military commanders. By May, that's when the Taliban, once the deal was signed, the Taliban put that in motion, right? They executed on that, I'll call it a soft campaign of influence. And you start seeing some more districts go contested and some more districts start to flip. That's when the Taliban really started to push outward and use those rings or those belts, I believe is what I called them at the time, in order to extend their influence. And then from May to June, to the end of June, I believe it went from somewhere around 70 districts controlled, and I want to say it was around 150 or so contested, to about 200 controlled and somewhere around 100 contested. And people are like, well, those numbers are no different. And I'm like, yeah, because that's when they decided, that's how they flipped it. Some were done militarily. Some the Taliban conquered. Some the Taliban got them to flee, and some of them they surrendered. And that's when it really started to come to a head. By the end of July, there was a ceasefire, a unilateral ceasefire from the Taliban, which Afghan officials were trying to tout as like, look, there might be and U.S. officials as well. And I remember saying at the time, oh no, it's on after this. And so, and I believe the first province fell by August 3rd, I want to say. Nimruz, by the way, which was the last province I would have predicted to fall, given the makeup of that province, right? They're anti-Taliban, Baluch, who had a real firm hold on Nimruz province. But when I thought about it a little while later, they read the writing on the wall and they bugged out to Iran. And that's when I saw that. I said, Nimruz is gone. This is done. I was like, we got 2 to 3 weeks. So, but yes, April, May, they flipped that soft influence campaign, and that's when they really started to turn it on. And and by the way, military leaders by the end of June, I believe, it was either General McKenzie, who was the head of CENTCOM, or General Milley, who was chairman Joint Chiefs of Staff. I remember them one of the two gave a briefing and was saying at the end of June, saying, oh, only like 70 to 80 districts are under Taliban control. And I had like 160 at the end of the June, or something like that. It was, and it was like weird watching them catch up to me over time. And because at some point it just became undeniable for them. They just couldn't. They were trying so hard to deny the facts on the ground. Like, I remember talking to reporters and they're like, I don't know what they're drinking over there, what they're smoking, but we know you're right, and listen, and I want to be very clear. It was difficult even for me to believe it. I had it was an assessment done from here where, again, I could always say, it could flip a certain percentage of those districts. But like at the end of the day, at the end of it all, I was like pinching myself. I was like, did that really happen? Did I really track this way? How did I do this? And how did, a multi-billion-dollar, billions of dollar defense and intelligence agencies, how did they get it so wrong? No one's ever answered that question. And you know how many times I've been asked by state and CIA and defense to ask that by them how I did it? Number 0. And you know what? If we think we're not going to repeat those mistakes, because I'm not I'll do it for free. I don't want to lose the next war. I didn't do this to poke a finger in the eye. I did this to try to prevent this debacle and hopefully, prevent the next one. We're not being honest with ourselves, and I fear we're not being honest with ourselves with what's happening in Ukraine. You're starting to see people start to question the counteroffensive and the effectiveness. And we pushed. Did we create a Ukrainian military and give them the equipment and all of the intelligence that we gave them? Is it possible that we might have got that wrong? I mean, look, this still has to play out. But I've got a lot of questions now, and I hope I'm wrong. I may very well be. These things can change, but you're starting to see a lot of reporting now questioning the viability of what's happening in Ukraine, what the Ukrainian military is capable of doing, and what are the implications of that? Afghanistan, at the end of the day, is we don't. Please, listeners, don't take this wrong. A backwater country that you could kind of walk away from and ignore. You can't ignore losing a war in Central Europe like this. And people will say, well, it's not our war, it's the Ukrainians' war. But we've made this into an issue. We've made this into a ride or die situation where, the defense of Europe and the viability of NATO and the free world rides on and falls on Ukraine's success. I didn't mean to go off on a tangent there, but these are the implications of not learning from your mistakes. The same people are in charge. No one paid a price for Afghanistan. No one resigned. No general was fired. General Milley, and Secretary Austin and the head of the CIA, right? All the same people. And if we think that, if they were capable of lying to themselves about Afghanistan or not getting it right, what leads me to believe they'll get the next one right?
Right, because to them, they didn't pay for it, like you said. I know who did, and there are people who've been on the show talking about what they saw at HKIA, and now they can't get a PTSD diagnosis because they weren't in a conflict zone. Oh my God, the things I've seen and heard at HKIA, if that's not a conflict zone, a combat zone, what is? That it's abhorrent that a human would have to be asked to do the things that those, Marines and soldiers were asked to do there.
Or all of the Afghans who are paying for it. The people that paid for this the most are those who deserved it the least. And it's right. It's disgraceful.
You're right. And if our leaders can make those decisions and not be taken to task for them, and that is our country's security, it's the world's security, it's the peace of mind of the people who do our fighting, there won't be people to do the fighting anyway. It's a very unsettling precedent that has been set here.
And really quickly, I was never more ashamed to be. As a matter of fact, I was never ashamed to be an American until when President Biden threw the Afghan government and the Afghan military under the bus and said they wouldn't fight when anywhere from 60 to 70,000 Afghan security forces died, and how many Afghans died in suicide attacks. And were they perfect? No, but how do who I love my country? When friends come to me and say, "Oh, my daughter is interested in joining the military," how do I, with a straight face, say to that person, we all know there's recruiting problems across the board in the U.S. military. How do I say to them with a straight face that your leadership has your back, that your government is fighting, right, not perfectly, but cares about the causes that they may put you into? I can't do it in good conscience. And I consider myself one of the more reasonable people when it comes to this. You talk to some veterans and, or guys who are serving, I know they don't want and the military, the volunteer military, a large percentage of the military comes from families, right? It's generational. Some of these guys are trying to talk their kids out of not joining the military. There's second and third order effects to the failure in Afghanistan that we haven't even considered, that I haven't even considered. I'm still trying to sort them out 2 years later.
It's absolutely, it's hard to fathom the hugeness of, this whole conflict and then the aftermath of it. I wanted to briefly talk about, you got pulled into the withdrawal in a different way. We kind of mentioned it in our previous episode, but I wondered if you could give us a description of how you got pulled in as U.S. forces were leaving, and what that was like for you.
Yeah, that was absolutely insane, and probably one of the lowest and highest moments of my life. It's really, talk about an emotional roller coaster. So at this time, as the withdrawal's happening, August 15th happens, I'm doing TV and I'm barely able to keep the Long War Journal updated. I'm trying to track whatever's happening, working 22, 23-hour days, literally, like eating ramen and frozen pizza. I was trapped at my place in the mountains because I didn't have 3 hours to drive home. Didn't see my family for 3 months. So I get a phone call a couple of weeks before the withdrawal from an organization whose name I won't mention. But basically the message is, Bill, if there's any Afghans who are, any Americans who need to get out of Afghanistan or having problems, let us know. We'll see what we could do to help. And if you understood what this organization was, you'd understand that they're no longer doing the job that was much needed to be doing. And they were concerned that Americans are going to be trapped in Afghanistan. I take this call. I want to say it was about 2-3 weeks before the collapse. And I'm kind of confused. I'm like, who do I know? What is this call all about? And I'm so busy at this point in time that it just sort of goes to the back of my mind. But I was a little puzzled by it. And then August 15th happens, and I get a call from a friend who's a former congressman. He says, Bill, I have a family of 5. They're trapped in Kabul. They can't get out. How can we help them? What can we do? A freaking congressman's calling me, a former congressman, right? This guy I know who he is. He's got contacts, and he's calling me, and I'm sitting here going, the hell do I do about this? Now, fortunately, an email went out at FDD, I want to say a couple days before, just mentioning something tangentially about this as well. I'd have to go dig it up. I can't really recall this, but I put 2 and 2 together and wound up linking this person up with this group that I got that phone call. And I look at this was, I think, it was really an emotional roller coaster, as I said. And, I'd like to consider myself I try to emotionally detach from these things, but I see this, I wound up getting this family of 5's passports in my freaking inbox. And it's a husband and wife, they're an oldest son and 2 daughters, all 2 years apart. It looked like my family exactly 10 years prior, right? Same age difference. I have the oldest son and 2 daughters. I remember calling my wife and practically breaking down. I just was like, I don't know what to do with this. And I just couldn't believe that this was happening. And so that was the genesis of just people who cared, some who were employed by the U.S. government who probably shouldn't have been doing what they were doing, we all just cast it to the wind. I didn't care at that point anymore. I'm like, you know what? Let 12 people try me for trying to get an American family out of Afghanistan. I didn't know what laws, if I was breaking laws. I probably wasn't, but it didn't matter, right? And I organized some people within FDD to help this one group raise money and just whatever I could do. I wound up acting more like a facilitator, linking people up and gathering information and passing them. I remember this one just wonderful woman who broke down on the phone crying to me several times, and I just didn't know what to do to help her, but she was just an instrumental piece in gathering the information and putting packets together, the SIVs and all that to, to get people out. And it was incredible. Like, I lost faith in my government, but I don't think I ever had any more faith in my fellow Americans, other than in certain instances in my time in service, right? It's or maybe with a good friend in a fist fight in much younger days, like that. It was depressing, and it was, but I was able to maintain hope through it. So, and these people, man, look, people like try to tell me, oh, you did it. I didn't do anything. I just forwarded emails, gathered information, tried to do my best to help coordinate, take pressure off of some people, link people up that needed to be talked. I remember being on one phone call and trying to point out the family and their phone's down to 2%. And I'm talking to someone going, they don't have it. I'm like, he looks like this. I'm texting the guy, what are you wearing? Like talking to someone who's on the wall, trying to pull him, he's supposed to be over there and he's got 2 kids. It was absolute insanity. And our government didn't give a shit.
Mm-hmm.
They did not care. They wanted that problem to go away. I know there were individuals within government who were helping, within the military, again, they all cast it to the wind. But remember the State Department didn't issue the warning to leave, until like 6 days before Kabul fell? I mean, I knew it was over by August 3rd when Nimruz collapsed. I knew that. It was so obvious.
There was like a sip and paint scheduled for the day before the evacuation started, I think. And it's in Task Force Pineapple Express, or Operation Pineapple Express, if you read the
Those
book.
are the group who I work with.
Yeah, and it's just incredible to think they were going to have a sip and paint. I think it was the day before the Taliban took control of Kabul. That's what happened. Like, how? And that's why we wanted to have you start this, because if they had been paying attention to the work that was being done, even if they had been looking at SIGAR's map, no matter what, they would have seen this coming, and they would have would not have been so bad. We wouldn't have had to ask individuals who are already overtaxed. And I mean, I know, Michael, you know all about those days of sleeplessness and doing that work. And I wasn't involved in the early days of the withdrawal, but I barely slept. I was watching TV nonstop, trying to figure out what was happening. So many people cared and did things. And if they hadn't, this would be an even worse situation. So that's why we wanted you to kick it off, because you had been doing this work for some time and people didn't want to listen and they didn't want to watch. And we never, I don't want to speak for you, Michael, I never want to see that happen again, ever in my lifetime, because it was the most disappointing thing I've ever witnessed. And like you, Bill, it's also introduced me to people like you and like Michael, who are some of the most selfless people that I've ever met, and who really care about humans that they've never met, because they know that they are humans and that they deserved to not be left behind and to not be left in such heinous conditions because of the whims of people who had no idea what was going on.
Or didn't want to know. And, it's the small victories I have to take. I mean, I don't know. I felt like at the time it almost broke me, right? But I refused to let them break me for their mistakes. And meeting you, Beth, and Michael, and the people I worked with at Pineapple Express and other places. And, those were I have to take those little victories out of this massive defeat that we had, because, out of a lot of bad, a little bit of good, and I have to carry that with me. It's all I can do, and try and advocate for us to not get caught in the same situation. I don't want to see this happen again. for the Afghan, in the case of Afghanistan, for the Afghans, for Americans, we all benefit when we make even half decent decisions. I mean, could have, we could have even muddled through it in some ways. But the debate in Washington was always stay and don't change things, or leave. There was never a third way discussed. It was something I advocated, and nobody wanted to hear it because Washington, everything, there's binary solutions, and you either do one thing or another. And usually those one thing or the other thing are stupid and don't make sense. Actually, they make a lot of sense, but they're simplistic, and they tend to lead to, if we had stayed and not changed how we were operating in Afghanistan, it would have been a slow burn loss, right? But that at least gives you time to readjust your strategy. But leaving, guaranteed loss. And those were the two choices that we were given. We were never given the option of withdrawing slowly, convincing the Afghans that this was their war, allowing them to fight, put together Northern Alliance 2.0. Yeah, they would have had to cede areas in the south and the east, very likely the Taliban, and fight hard to retake areas in the north. But we yanked the rug from under them completely. Once the U.S. was leaving, there was no capacity for maintenance and everything that needed to keep the modern Afghan military that we foisted upon them. And then all of a sudden said, well, can't have that anymore.
It's hard. And I imagine that all of these episodes are going to be hard. Michael and I have already started recording a lot of this series, and it's a lot of very intense moments. And I think for our listeners, we just want to, I don't know, end on a note of hopefulness that we are all still in this. There are so many people who still care. And if you're feeling alone, I think there are a lot of groups that are being created now just to bring people together. I'd like to just mention OAR Foundation, Operation Allies Refuge Foundation, and that's for any veterans of the conflict who feel, it's to counteract moral injury and give veterans who were at HKIA, for instance, a place to talk about what they saw, because so many were quieted and told not to talk about what they saw. And I think it's especially hard for volunteers. I think we've kind of coalesced and found our own places to feel safe, or to safely discuss the things that irritate us, I should say. It's not like we're not safe. It's just most people don't want to hear us wax poetic about Afghanistan, I think. But I think it's important to be able to talk about these things and to kind of keep them in mind. And I know before we close today, we actually want to share the story of an Afghan man whom we're calling Nimatullah. And we are grateful to him for actually, this came through a volunteer. But we want to talk about his story. He is an SIV applicant whose son suffers from hemophilia. And this is his story in his own words. I, Nimatullah, was born on September 26, 1980 in Western Afghanistan. Due to the traditional customs of society at the time, my father was married 3 times and now has 3 wives. I have 7 brothers and 9 sisters. I grew up in a situation where my family experienced severe security and economic problems because of the long wars in Afghanistan. At that time, my father could not afford the expenses of the house. The dictatorial government hunted the youths and sent them to war. I had to work to survive, and I had to protect myself from the government. All the dreams I had for myself as a child were destroyed by war. This is the fate of many of my peers. We have always been victims of the ambition and totalitarianism of our corrupt and traitorous leaders. I loved Rahima since I was a teenager, and I watched her from afar. Taliban people, if they find a boy or girl talking, applied Sharia law and stoned both of them. So I always hid my love for Rahima in my heart to protect myself and her. But with the arrival of the American troops in Afghanistan, everything changed rapidly, and the youth gained their freedom. Schools and universities were opened, and I was also able to tell Rahima that I loved her. That moment will remain the most beautiful moment of my life forever. Rahima and I got married in 2003. We were very happy. In November 2005, Asadullah, my first son, was born. I imagined that the dreams I had as a child that did not come true because of the war would happen for Asadullah, that he would grow up and be happy. But as if my misfortunes were not over, when Asadullah was 6 months old, we found out he was diagnosed with hemophilia. There were not enough facilities for his treatment. His illness was destined to never improve, and we had to prepare ourselves for this situation. 2 years later, my second child, Hussein, was born. He was healthy, and this made us find ourselves a little bit. With Hussein's arrival, I was able to find a better job. I applied for work with an American institution and was accepted and hired as a security guard. My income was good, and I could buy Asadullah's medicines and take home better food. Rahima could also continue her education. Even though the Taliban and ISIS did not threaten those who worked with the Americans with death, they used to carry out threats against my work. Until 2015, I worked with the American forces in different departments, but the American institutions left my province. In August 2021, after the foreign forces left Afghanistan, the Taliban occupied Afghanistan again. We thought the Taliban had changed and there was no more extremism. We were wrong. Not all women can finish college anymore. Now no women can attend college. And in fact, the Taliban, just as an aside, just made it so that girls above 10 can no longer go to school. So it's just a further breakdown of who can attend school. Soon the Taliban people came to those who were working with foreigners. They were looking for me and my family from house to house. The Taliban are not answerable to anyone at the local level. I lived in secret for a long time. At the same time, God sent us an angel named June. She called me son even though we were far apart, and she talked to me for hours so we would not be depressed. She comforted us so we would not be disappointed. She helped me complete my chief of mission application for the special immigrant visa program and provided both material and spiritual help for me and Rahima. For the first time, we were experiencing motherly feelings through June, who is now an integral part of our lives. I hope to see her closely and in honor of all the moments she grieved for us to kiss her hand. Thanks to June, we've been able to find ourselves again. Now my family and I are only thinking about how long it will take for our request to go through the stages and to be able to transfer Asadullah to America. His disease is rare. Imagine, once his mouth bled for 25 days because of lack of treatment. There is no possibility of medicine here. If he isn't transported, we will lose him. Every day he gets new bleeds. Rahima and I can't do anything but hope. We're really grateful to Nimatullah for letting us share his story. And for all our Afghan listeners, we would really love to tell your stories too, because it feels different for us to talk about this than it would to be able to share the stories of the people who are actually impacted by this in a very different way. You can send any letters, poems, whatever you feel like sharing, videos to our show address, which is the Afghanistan Project Podcast at gmail.com. Bill, thanks so much for, again, giving such a thoughtful and fact-filled the kickoff to our sub-series. It was really fantastic to spend time with you.
It was my pleasure. Always a pleasure to join you, Michael. Beth, I really appreciate what you do. I appreciate what you do to keep this very important issue, to keep it alive, and for sharing those stories like Ramitullah's. As dark as it is, there is still hope, and we have to keep that hope alive. And I thank you both from the bottom of my heart for everything that you do to help keep this important story alive.
Oh, we feel the same way to you, Bill, for keeping up the good fight. Thanks to all our listeners, too, for sharing your time with us and supporting the people of Afghanistan. Tasha Kaur, and we hope to see you again soon.